Welcome, everyone, to the Smart Connector podcast. We're live today with Paul Shotton. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, Jane.
So, Paul is a consultant, a speaker, a former investment banker, and author of Doomed to Fail, which talks about resilience in challenging times and a lot of very interesting stuff about government, politics, systems, and why things don't work always as we'd like them to. So, Paul, you're based in New York, aren't you?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, even though you're a Brit.
I'm a Brit originally, but I've been here for nearly 20 years, yeah.
Yep, exactly. So, before we get into it, Paul, tell us a bit about your background.
As I say, I was born in the United Kingdom. Ever since I was a small boy, I was always passionate to understand how things worked, how the world worked, and that initially was manifested in things like the natural world and what's called the seasons. And to this day, my passion outside of my work is gardening, and from that, it was a natural progression that I would want to study science. So I studied physics at university and intended on a career in academia. Originally, I did research at CERN, the Handy Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, in particle physics. But after I'd done research for a few years, I came to realize that really what I enjoyed was understanding how things worked. And I'd benefited from many years at school and at university of short courses, concatenating several hundred years worth of scientific discovery into short courses and crammed with information that I could absorb. And when you get to the cutting edge of research, the pace of learning slows. So I wasn't so interested in that. And I made a switch to investment banking. I went to work for Goldman Sachs in London, and they were interested in me because this was the early days of financial engineering and derivatives. They wanted a quant who could value these complex products.
A quant. So
Quant,
that is
yes. I was hired as a trader on the Eurobond desk, but as a very much a quantitative trader, yes.
A quantitative trader.
Yeah.
And quant can also refer to quantum physics, right? Because that's something that you're very passionate about, isn't it?
Yeah, quantum physics was the basis of the research of particle physics, the research, one of the two great theories of the 20th century, alongside relativity theory. So certainly quantum physics is very important. Of course, nowadays there are great interests in using quantum computers, which is an interesting and new development that can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so you certainly had an illustrious career because you went from Goldman Sachs to other investment banks, didn't you? Including one that collapsed, right?
Yeah, the role that brought me from London to New York was at Lehman Brothers, and I came here in 2004 to be global head of market risk at Lehman, and I was living the life. I had a great role at a great bank until, of course, disaster struck in 2008. Started in 2007, 2008, and Lehman unfortunately failed at that time, which was it was completely devastating, obviously, to everybody who worked at the firm, and caused a tremendous amount of stress to the global economy.
Yes, certainly. I mean, Lehman Brothers weren't the only bank that failed around that time, were they? But it was certainly a very high-profile case, wasn't it?
It was probably the biggest bankruptcy in the United States, certainly, and a very high-profile case, and it's still referred to this day. Whereas in the banks that failed in the UK, for example, Northern Rock, the Building Society, and Halifax, and so on, were much smaller operations, but no less impactful in terms of the local economy there.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So we're going to talk about the banking system. That's one of the things we're going to go into today. But let's actually talk about your book, Doomed to Fail, Paul. So you've got a copy, haven't you? So do you want to hold that up?
I do indeed. This is the book, Doomed to Fail. So you can see it actually exists. It's not just a figment of mine or Jane's imagination. So it's a real book.
Yes, exactly. So tell us about Doomed to Fail. What's it all about and what inspired you to write it?
Well, in recent years, there's been increasing loss of faith in democracy and capitalism to deliver fair outcomes for people. It's easy to see why that is. There's increasing wealth disparity. We talked a little bit about the global financial crisis when Lehman failed. That was certainly part of that, as was globalization and the hollowing out of the middle classes. but that's brought about increasing discontent. Surveys done by the likes of Cambridge University and the Economist Intelligence Unit show that people are losing faith, and that's a tragedy, because in all of the hundreds of thousands of years of life on Earth, for the vast majority of that time, but everything until the last 150 years, essentially, life for everybody was nasty, brutish, and short. All the progress has occurred very recently, thanks to the scientific enlightenment supported by the twin elements of liberal democracy and capitalism. So the fact that we might be thinking, or people might be thinking of jettisoning democracy, is as a tragedy. So I wrote the book really as a warning and a call to action to defend democracy and capitalism.
Yeah, democracy and capitalism, the two pillars of the free world, right?
Yes, indeed, that's right.
Okay, yeah. So I've read your book, Paul, and it's certainly an absolutely fascinating read. So, so let's talk about, okay, so why government is incapable of living up to our hopes. So there's a lot of people at the moment that are very disappointed, not just in governments here in the UK, but really all over the world, and certainly in the US. So what is the issue there? What's going on?
Well, I think I root the explanation for what's going on back to my career in physics and the idea of complex adaptive systems. A lot of originally this concept goes back to the early 19th century, in fact, but a lot of work was done on these in the 1980s, 1990s, the time when I was active in research, and they have very broad applicability to in nature, things like insect populations and to large collections of particles, for example. But it also applies to human society, though, because we have individual agency. We can choose how we what we do. We're influenced by various things. Social media influences our family members, friends, and so on. But we have individual agency, and that means that society is an example of a complex adaptive system. And it's the properties of these systems, I think, that give rise to the my observation that democracy is the best form of political organization and capitalism is the best form of economic organization. So
Yeah.
if I can talk about these properties, what they are. So the complexity comes from the fact that they are highly nonlinear. Generally, we're used to simple linear systems. If you make a small change in an input, if there's a small error in one of the input factors, it gives rise to only a small change in the output. But these systems don't behave like that. They're highly nonlinear. They tend to obey power laws. So the output is some input raised to quite a large power. So here we're operating in the realms of things like chaos theory and the idea of the butterfly flapping its wings in the Philippines, giving rise to the formation of a hurricane over the North Atlantic. Small changes give rise to massive changes in the output. Another element of them is that they're deeply interconnected. Different components of the system have deep interconnections with one another, and that, combined with this nonlinearity, means that classic techniques of dealing with complicated problems, breaking them down into their components and then getting experts to solve each component and then reconstitute the whole, that simply doesn't work. You have to look at the whole thing as a single unit, not just the components, and that makes them very hard to deal with, because experts tend to be expert in a relatively narrow field of expertise. And then the final element is their adaptivity, the fact that because of endogenous changes or changes within the system, the way that other people in this case are behaving, as well as external changes in laws, changes in regulations, mean that the system changes to react to these shocks, these external changes or internal changes. And these adaptations are essentially random. They're completely unpredictable. And this combination of the nonlinearity, the deep interconnections, the adaptivity is fundamentally the reason why the future is unknowable. And that, I think, is the essence of the reason why democracy is best. It's because we're asking our political leaders to make policy, to determine, make laws and make decisions in the backdrop of this situation in which things are fundamentally unknowable. Now, politicians may be very, very smart. They may get lucky for a while, make a few good decisions. Political power is very seductive. So as long as they're making good decisions and they get re-elected, they will remain in power. But eventually there'll be an accumulation of mistakes or things which, with hindsight, turn out to have been mistakes. And at that point, we want to change the policy, certainly. And it's not credible for a politician to say, oh, that policy I've espoused for the last 5 years, no, I'm sorry, it was wrong. It didn't work. We need to change that. It wouldn't be credible for a politician to do that. So, want to change the policy, we have to change the politician. And this is the reason why democracy, I think, is the best. It's because democracy gives us regular elections. It's a peaceful means of removing one set of failed politicians from power and bringing a new set of politicians into power, and society that can then take a new direction. In contrast to that, in an autocracy, the leaders make mistakes just the same as they do in a democracy, but they're without a peaceful means of removing them from power. They tend to double down on their mistakes and they repress sections of their population in order to win favor with other parts of the population, other larger parts of the population, which is what Xi Jinping in China does with the Uyghurs in Western China. And they tend to wage war on their neighbors, as Vladimir Putin in Russia is doing with Ukraine, as a means of drumming up, the rally around the flag effect and drumming up support domestically. So autocracies are much more likely to lead to war. They're much more likely to start wars. Doesn't mean that say that democracies won't engage in wars and bad acts too. They will, but they're much less likely to do so. And the freedom offered in a democracy is much better. And as I say, I think it's rooted in this fact that society is as an example of this complex adaptive system.
So understanding that society is made up of a complex adaptive system that is constantly changing and that it's very random and unpredictable, and that essentially what you're saying is that plans, it doesn't matter how good they are, strategies, plans, or whatever, you cannot build certainty into the outcome, right? So
we can know far less than we would like to, and often we think to. We need to be far more humble. And it's an important lesson for people in business, I think, is to you can have a beautiful theory, but as the biologist Thomas Huxley said, there's nothing more sad than the destruction of a beautiful theory by an ugly fact. And it behoves us all to rely on the experimental method, to try things out and see how they work. You need to get feedback from your experiments and see what's working and what doesn't, rather than just go gung ho into some grand idea that you might have because you're likely to be your expectations are likely to fall, or the outcome is likely to fall well short of your expectations.
Okay, so I mean that's very interesting to understand. And what is the practical consequence, for example, for governments, for people who influence economic policy, for business people? Why is this knowledge useful for them?
Well, as I say, when you understand that this is the kind of environment in which you're operating, I think it helps you to be more humble, to recognize your limitations. I mean, the kind of people who rise to power in political frameworks, indeed in business, they tend to be very egotistical. They tend to be very, very sure of themselves. It's part of the confidence that you need to get yourself elected or to get yourself hired into a position as a chief executive or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But humility, it behoves everyone to have a degree of humility and to realize that what you can know is far less than you would like.
So do you have a system for dealing with this complex adaptive system existence, let's just say? Do you put a system on top of that in terms of actually how to respond to that lack of predictability and
Yeah.
change?
I think the best approach is the scientific method. The scientific method has been responsible for all of the progress, essentially, the increase in lifespans, the increased health, and so on that people enjoyed, which, as I say, has all occurred in the last 150 years, since about 1870, the time of the latter part of the Industrial Revolution. And it's a date which the economic historian Brad DeLong refers to as the hinge of history, because if you plot a chart of gross domestic product per head on a chart over time, for the most time it's a flat line along the bottom, and then suddenly around 1870, time of the Industrial Revolution, it shoots up. It looks like this hinge, and it's as I say, it's the scientific enlightenment, adopting scientific approaches, trial and error. Science is essentially a negative belief system in the sense that it would take an infinite number of data points. Every point in space and time you would have to measure in order to prove a theory is correct, whereas it only takes one data point to prove that a theory is incorrect, or at least needs to be modified. And so I think this the essence of the scientific method: try things out, see what works, be prepared to experiment. The things that do work, put more investment, follow those and let the others fall away. That, I think, is the essence of progress in science and indeed in business.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for that. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve now, because you do talk about that quite a lot in your book, don't you, Paul?
Yes.
So you write about the Federal Reserve's role in managing monetary policy and in regulating the banks. So what has this got to do with democracy and capitalism?
Well, I mean, central banks for several years now, for many years, since the Central Bank of New Zealand was the first bank to be given responsibility for the independent management of monetary policy. Independent meaning independent of political interference. And over time, most of the world's major central banks, certainly the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the ECB in the European Union, they have independent control of monetary policy. And they're usually charged with several things. The Federal Reserve in the United States is charged with what's referred to as the dual mandate of maintaining full employment consistent with low and moderate inflation. And they define low and moderate to be this 2% threshold. Many central banks have adopted a 2% threshold for that. And so, however, the central banks they only have one lever, one tool to manage monetary policy. The monetary policy is their tool that they use to have to manage inflation, and they're also asked to manage unemployment, and then bank regulation at the same time. When you've only got one tool and you've got these multiple targets, these multiple things that you're trying to manage, that can often lead to problems.
Yeah. So what kind of problems could they lead to?
Well, I think that it's difficult to operate monetary policy independent of fiscal policy, which is what happens in most countries. The government's responsible for fiscal policy, how much money flows through the economy and so on, and the central bank is managing monetary policy. It would be more harmonious to have the two run together, right? In most cases, I think. One of the problems that the Fed had, what the Fed experienced, was that it's something which became known from the time Alan Greenspan became Fed chairman back in August of 1987. He followed Paul Volcker. Volcker was lauded for taming the great inflation of the 1970s and the 1980s by jacking up monetary policy, interest rates to very high levels in order to kill inflation. But I think, in fact, Volcker he certainly helped to tame inflation, but there were other things going on at the same time. You had Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, weakening the power of trades unions. The power of labor to negotiate fair compensation was also weakened by globalization, the bringing of China and other countries in Southeast Asia. New people joining the workforce could offer labor at much lower rates. More women were joining the workforce. So collectively, these things weakened the bargaining power of labor. So the great moderation in inflation, I think, was at least as much to do with these elements as it was to do with the central banks. And the great moderation, I think the central banks largely had an easy ride over a period of 40 years of declining inflation, declining interest rates, until inflation got let out of the bag as a result of the fiscal stimulus to the coronavirus pandemic and the effects of the pandemic on screwing up supply chains and so on.
Yeah, of course. So do you think that fundamental change is needed within the banking industry, or do you think that change is happening all the time and that it's a good change? What's your view now in terms of what's
Well,
happening?
well, I think the Federal Reserve inadvertently led to a lot of the problems that manifested themselves in the global financial crisis.
Mm,
And I mentioned Alan Greenspan. He came to the to run the Fed, to be chairman of the Fed in August 1987. A few months after he was appointed in October 1987, there was the stock market crash. The U.S. stock market fell by 20%. Uh, it was a huge move at the time, and Greenspan did quite the right thing of reducing interest rates, flooding the market with liquidity to help stabilize the banking system and so on. So that was the right policy at the time. But this same kind of policy, whenever there was stress in the financial markets, subsequently in 1992, there was trouble with the sterling's ejection from the European exchange rate mechanism. 1994 bond market collapse. 1987 Asian financial crisis. 1998 Russia default and the long-term capital management failure. And in 2000 the dot-com bust and so on. Over a period of time, the Fed's policy response of always slashing interest rates to flood the market with liquidity stabilized the banking system, but they were seen to be asymmetric in their behavior. Greenspan would talk about irrational exuberance when the markets were rallying very strongly, but didn't really raise interest rates to reduce that. So he had a kind of what the market came to believe. They had a one-sided monetary policy. When the Fed would always have your back whenever there's weakness in the stock market. The Fed would always have your back, and the market's back. And this became known as the Greenspan put. And later on, when Bernanke replaced Greenspan, the Bernanke put, and then when Janet Yellen came in, the Yellen put. And this asymmetric response, I think, gave rise to too much complacency in markets and for people to take too much risk. There was an economist, Hyman Minsky, in the 1970s who developed this theory, Minsky's instability hypothesis, that stability, financial market stability, begets instability because stability encourages people to take more and more risk. And I think that this is what happened during the 1990s, the early part of the 2000s. There were other policy mistakes made by the US government of perfectly laudable reasons, encouraging people to own homes, something called the Communities Reinvestment Act. And it encouraged, people became conditioned to the idea house prices are a good investment. House prices only ever go up. You see that in the United Kingdom too. So all of these fragilities, these problems were building up in the market, and the Fed didn't really address those, didn't lean into those. And again, duly when markets got into trouble, started to get in trouble from 2007, 2008. Again, the Fed flooded the markets with liquidity. When interest rates hit the zero bound, they had quantitative easing, further, throwing further, more and more money into the economy. But they were very slow again to withdraw money after the crisis. That they never really were able to normalize interest rates until, lo and behold, the coronavirus pandemic, came along, and this flooding the markets with the liquidity blew up a large asset price bubble. Asset prices in the form of real estate and equities and so on, very tight credit spreads, low interest rates. So assets generally increased in value, and that was great for people who already owned assets, people who were already wealthy, but not so good for young people who were wanting to acquire assets in order to fund a pension later in life, or wanted to buy a home and start a family and so on. So I think that the Fed's actions leading up to the crisis and in the immediate aftermath of it increased this feeling of wealth disparity, and the
yeah.
fact that the fact that the economy was being rigged in favor of the protected class. Wall Street got bailed out, Main Street took the hit.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Wall Street got bailed out, Main Street took the hit. Yes, because that is the way that the world is going really today, isn't it? There is the middle class is becoming the underclass.
It seems to be like that, yeah.
Yeah, which is obviously it's very depressing thought really for most people who are not wealthy in the wealthy minority. So
Yeah.
what can your average person do then? Anybody that's kind of listening and they'll be thinking, "Oh, the banking system is rigged against us and doomed to fail and that there's nothing really I can do as the little guy." What would be your response to that, Paul?
Well, I think people should uh, take part in elections. Young people tend to be much less vociferous. They tend to not vote in elections as much as the older people do, and they're turning their back on democracy. I think that's a big mistake. It's obviously a mistake of our political leaders as well, not to and people in business, that the wealthy, they ought to realize for their own sake that their wealth, the wealth that they enjoy, the good outcomes that they have, is thanks to democracy. They should realize that whilst they benefited from things like globalization, and they benefited from the low interest rates after the global financial crisis, they should be prepared to share some of that largesse with other people, because if they don't, then they do risk what I refer to in my book as throwing out the babies of democracy and capitalism together with the dirty bathwater of wealth inequality. I think that was the big problem. As I say, globalization was hugely beneficial. It was part of reducing inflation and reducing interest rates. The fact that countries, United States and Western Europe, could import all of these very cheap goods built with cheap labor in China, that was hugely beneficial in reducing inflation. So everybody benefited from that. But of course, that's an easy argument to make if you're not at risk of losing your job yourself. Whereas
Mm.
the middle class person who was working in manufacturing in the United States or Western Europe, but who did lose their jobs because their job got exported to China, that's much tougher for them to accept. So it would have been much better, I think, had the wealthy, through wealth transfers through the tax system, higher taxation, to share some of that largesse on the people who were being displaced and dispossessed, and help to help them to find a new place. Back in the United Kingdom, I think the Brexit vote is an example of that. I mean, ostensibly, Brexit was about the desire of the United Kingdom to take back control from Brussels. But in reality, I think it was much more to do with the dispossessed, the post-industrial cities like Stoke-on-Trent and like Sunderland wanting to take back control from an overconcentration of power and wealth in London and the southeast.
Mm.
Now, Brexit obviously was very divisive in the UK. I'm not sure that those wounds have been healed yet, but increasingly there seems to be evidence that the economy is weaker as a result of the UK having left the European Union than it would otherwise have been. So I think the point is that if the protected class, if the wealthy, if the politically elite, if the political elite, if they don't take more care of the interests of the middle class and the working class people, then this increasing political polarization, increased risk of revolution and extreme events does increase. It would behove them to be very careful about that, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's very, very interesting, Paul, and very good advice for anybody who is in a position of power and influence, and an important lesson to take on. So, one more question before we go, which is really about artificial intelligence,
Okay.
because that's such a hot topic right now. So, do the ideas that you talk about in Doom to Fail have any relevance to the use of AI in business, for example?
Yes, I think they do. I mean, artificial intelligence, I mean, the underlying ideas, the algorithms and so on were developed in the 1950s, 1960s. They've been well established. Uh, but the things which have enabled AI to take off in the last few years have been two elements. One, massive amounts of computing power, relatively cheap computing power through the cloud, and the other is huge amounts of data. There are sensors everywhere. There's far more data available, and through the internet, far more data about people's behavior. So now, with the power and the data, these algorithms are able to put to work, and they are incredibly powerful. They will going to be extremely useful. Now, as with any technology, there will be downside. There will be risks as too, in the same way that with a simple tool like a kitchen knife that you use to prepare vegetables and meat for your dinner could be used to stab somebody.
Mm.
We're not going to ban knives because of that. You ban the idea. You ban the idea of stabbing somebody. You ban the idea of killing somebody. But you keep the technology because of the beneficial effects that it can have. So I think the same approach should be taken with artificial intelligence. Yes, there will be downsides. The problems of hallucinations and sample are well known, but it will go on to be a very powerful and very important tool. But there's one element in particular which I think is interesting. Goes back to the idea of adaptivity. So artificial intelligence models are essentially tools of pattern recognition. They're extremely powerful tools of pattern recognition using this data to see patterns. I mean, we humans are very good at pattern recognition ourselves. I suspect that goes back to the to the early days of humanity on the African savannah, when somebody could spot movement in the grass, might be a leopard or some other dangerous animal, they ran away and lived and got to pass on their genes to the next generation, whereas the person who couldn't spot the thing got eaten and taken out of the gene pool. So the pattern recognition is the essence of this. But whenever you're using this historical data that you have and applying pattern recognition models to it, implicitly you're assuming that the data you have, historical data you have, is a good representation of the future. Now, because of the problems with, or the point of adaptation, the fact that markets change and adapt over time, it may well be the case that the data you have is not a good representation of the way that the future is going to be. And so artificial intelligence models have the same issue with that we humans would have in terms of looking at historical data. And I don't think there's a technique to address that. It's one of the reasons why I think there will always be a need for human ingenuity, even though there's no doubt that artificial intelligence models will become more and more powerful, that they're never going to be worse in the future than they are now. And there's tremendous progress being made over the last couple of years, and that's going to continue. But this issue of the data and how the adaptive process of markets, I think, is something that needs to be borne in mind whenever you're using these models, and particularly when you're basing conclusions and policy decision taking actions on the basis of them.
Amazing. Well, Paul, all I can say is it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It
Thank you
has
very much
been
for inviting me.
really interesting. And your book, I've read Doomed to Fail myself. It is a really, really interesting read for anybody who's interested in politics, economics, complex adaptive systems, quantum physics, or the investment banking world. Anybody that is really interesting to lift is really interested to lift the bonnet and actually find out what is happening in that world and why. I would definitely recommend Paul's book. Do you want to just hold it up again, Paul, before we go? It's available on Amazon, isn't it?
It's available on Amazon. Yes, there's some very nice reviews there too, and that's the easiest way for you to get hold of it. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me onto the show, Jane.
Yes, and if anybody wants to get in touch with you, Paul, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can contact me through email, paulshotton@optonline.net, or they can give me a call. They can contact me through LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me, I'll very happily accept your invitation.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you again, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure, and see you again soon.
The pleasure being all mine, Jane. Thank you.